Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the U.S. population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Ashley Brown.
Hello, Scott Osborne. How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you today?
Good. I'm kind of excited about our topic today because we've been talking about this for a while and have just getting around to doing a show on it.
You are right, since the very beginning. And actually, we're doing two shows on it. This is Women in Media, broadly interpreted. So we're going to be talking in two different shows, probably spaced out, about all things gender and media. Do we want to say anything about what's in the news, or are we just going to fast forward right to our topic here today? Maybe we should go right to our topic today.
Wow. Like that felt a little like a setup.
No, we're going to go right to our topic
let's go right to our topic. There's so much. And I think we're going to be addressing some of those and others. But let's just say this, and I think this topic is included in that. It's so important to get to baseline information, data, reason, like all of those things. I just think there's, again, so much noise and so much purposeful trying to pit people against each other and bring fear into things that I just think we have to be mindful of that. Can I say that about what's in the news?
You can always say that. Absolutely. That it's important to ratchet down the tempo. It's always okay to pause before making a decision or saying something and think through what your goal is. So I'm totally down with that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we try to do is strip away any of the emotional things and just talk about what's happening. And we've had so many great guests of late.
We have, and I'm very excited. We have some really exciting ones coming up who will remain unnamed for the moment, but treat that as just a real little bit of an advance notice. So I'm happy about that too.
Yes. Okay, so talk to me about just the broader topic about representation in media. And we're going to start this one with kind of people behind the camera, behind the scenes, like producers, directors, that kind of piece.
A little bit. And I want to talk about more than just visual media. We think visual media and we say sort of behind the camera. There's kind of who makes the media and why that's important. And then what we see or hear, for that matter, in the media, why that's important. And I want to first just give kind of an overall plug in that media is uniquely important as an industry for representation. You know, it's not just like, who's your electrician and do we need more female electricians, which is fine, but it makes no other real big difference in terms of socialization. But because media is such a socializing force for all of us. You think, how do we get our ideas and beliefs and perspectives? You know, it's our parents, it's our school, it's our environment, but increasingly it's our media that literally shapes who we become. So if what we see and that's controlled by who makes it is just uniquely important in the media. So it's not just like, hey, we want more women, camera women, just because the jobs should be equitable. Sure, maybe they should be equitable, but it's so much more than that. It's as a shaping force for our society is why media is so critical. So it's why we always we have an entire organization through women's eyes is gender equality through media. That's how we think about kind of a root cause issue of who we are. And I should say, and we'll get to this, it's not just how women are shaped, it's how men are shaped, the images they see. It's, you know, racial, it's ethnic, it's across the board. So that's my plug for why media is really uniquely important in terms of thinking about who's involved.
Well, and I think that that's a really important plug. And I think it kind of underscores what we were talking about at the beginning is especially because you said visual, but if we talk about social media as another just whole thing and content creators of what's the angle, what's your algorithm, what are you being fed, and questioning, always having curiosity, I think is important. So and so talk about the different versions of media. Can you just go through
Sure.
and
Yeah,
educate us?
I was going to say, and there's some interesting data, and I would say this is wonderful. There's some organizations that gather this data. They're in our show notes for people who want to plummet more. You know, the Gina Davis Institute, the Annenberg School. There's a group in USCLA, and you know, thanks to the miracle of a variety of technological things, they can track this so easily now. You can literally track how often and how much speaking time, for example, different characters have on films. So there's a lot of data. So there's visual media, there's podcasts, which
Mhm.
are just, you know, who would have thought 20 years ago the role podcasts would have? Phenomenally popular, which is great. I love them. But we'll
Mhm.
look at disparities in that. Radio, traditional radio that still does exist, is still used. Advertisements on all forms, whether it's traditional TV or ads on that pop up in social media, Facebook, wherever they show up. But I think also things like art and theater. When we go to museums, I've talked about literature. Who's writing the books we read? What books are being nominated for awards? Theater. So I kind of wrap these all. It's almost, you know, the arts. And there's global data and then there's US data. But if we just look at US for the moment, I want to start with podcasts because interestingly, podcasts now are one of the media forms that are skewing the most in gender, on the most male oriented, you would say. So, of the top 100 shows, women run about a third of them, not even quite a third. So 60 some percent are male hosts. But even more important is that of the top 100, half of them have no female guests. They're men talking to other men. So that's what we're hearing a lot of, we're seeing a lot of. And again, that sort of it perpetuates the notion of male as the default authority figure.
Mhm.
So that's an interesting one to watch and keep an eye out for. It's one of the most, as we say, skewed in gender. I will just spoiler alert say one of the least skewed actually is popular music. Um, you
Ah.
know, yeah, as a form, I mean, you probably know, you can think of singers and bands and groups, you know, women, men, they're both out there mixing it up with a lot of much more equal space. Anyway, so that's podcasts.
This seems like a time for me to bring up Taylor Swift again. I feel like you laid that out there for me, so thank you.
You could, I mean, there's a whole new generation of women, and it's not, you know, it's not taking away from some of our male artists or our traditional male groups or anything. Harry Styles just dropped a new album, you know, but you've got so many female artists also that are really able to hold the stage. It seems easier for diverse audiences to support them, which is interesting. And but that we could do a deep dive on that. But let me talk a little bit about visual media. Um, there's many different analyses, but of the top 120 films over across 11 countries, women only have a third of the speaking roles. So again, think about this. So women speak only a third of the time across all these different films. Women are about 9%, if I have the figure right. I didn't look this one up recently, of camera women.
Mhm.
Grossly underrepresented as directors. You know, the director gets to set the stage, gets to say, "Hey, what's the vision of this film?" You could you
Right.
name female directors actually off the top of your head? Not to put you on the spot. Any female
Um,
directors?
the one that just comes immediately to mind is
Her,
African American woman, DuVernay. Da, da, da.
Ava DuVernay.
Yes,
Okay,
Ava
okay, that's
DuVernay.
one.
Greta Gerwig.
Okay,
That's
Barbie.
two.
Yeah, that's two.
I feel like did Scarlett Johansson just direct?
I'm not sure about that. Certainly, as an actor, she's well known. Chloe
Yeah.
Zhao. Do you remember Chloe Zhao? Anyway, women have won, you know, a handful of Oscars over what, 50 some years of Oscars.
Right.
Totally a handful. Very few director roles. They're not moving up. They're about 12% of the editors. So all of the people who are behind the camera, who are making the films, it's overwhelmingly male. We were making a little bit of progress, I think, in 24. We've since
Mhm.
backslid, but again, many of those things have been in the pipeline for a long time. So our visual media, we usually say, is still overwhelmingly female. That's especially true for film, a little bit less so for some of the streaming series, scripted
Mhm.
series. You are seeing more women in, but you know, I run a women's film.
Olivia Wilde.
Okay,
That's a good
good.
one. Olivia Wilde. Gotta
I
have
run a women's film festival. So here's a way of thinking about it. And this is films by or about women.
her.
But on every topic, Any topic under the sun. We have environmental films. We have the war in Ukraine. We have all kinds of topics. We have aging. We have young people. I say, it's not just for women. It's for everyone to come see these films.
Mm-hmm.
You've been at a men's film festival your whole entire life. You probably just never realized it.
Right.
The vast majority of the films that you have seen, wherever they are, were made by men. And so you watched it, probably didn't give it a second thought. You say, oh, that looks interesting. I'll go see that film. So we always say to have more female perspectives because their lived experience is often different. We want those on the screen too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit about visual media.
Can I stop 1 second on here? Because
Yes.
with film and TV and all of that, looking at nudity, I think that's an interesting point of view on nudity for women versus men.
That is a very interesting one. We're going to talk about that some more in part 2, but I will give you a little headline. It is absolutely true that women are far more likely to be what you might call scantily clad, revealing clothing, or nudity than men. It's not just an accident. And this is both in mainstream films, but especially in things like advertisements and in scripted shows. I was at the gym the other day, and there's Jeopardy, or one similar title, but one of those game shows, and there was an image that I thought had sort of died in the 1960s, maybe, or 70s at the very least. A woman with a very short, revealing dress, the long hair, just a very hyper feminine look, and she's, gesturing to the car, which is about what you were to win. So
right.
the notion of sort of quote unquote comely female as advertising bait for things like automobiles, it is still powerful. It is still out there. So, the whole notion is eyeballs on women with not much clothing, usually with a lot of cleavage showing, to advertise product. Totally woven into so much of advertising as well as films. So, while we're talking about the impact, think about the cumulative impact of that. I mean, you and I can sort of analyze it. Most people don't analyze it. They just get these images constant. We're on screens now from 11 to 13 hours a day. So,
Wow.
to eliminate work, that's so much of our waking days between all these devices, the mini phone, the tablet, the laptop, the big screen, add them all up, we're on screen. So visual media, we're just constantly bombarded by these. So we normalize it. We simply normalize these kinds of things without even realizing it. So the socialization impact is huge.
Sorry, I'm just processing that for a second because it's almost half of our waking time.
Correct. Now, obviously, there's other things that drill down on what kinds of screen. That's screen that work too. I mean, if you're working on a screen, you're on screen time, you know. But for people, again, whose televisions are on kind of nonstop, that's certainly a certain segment of the population. People who might watch certain things during the day, they're going to scroll through their social media an hour or two in the mornings, the middle of the day, then in the evening, add it up, So the screen exposure is a big thing. And, it's harder. This is a tangential issue, but I think about it, you can't avoid them in public places either the way you used to. You go to an airport, you go to a doctor's office, you go to a waiting room, wherever. There's screens piped in. And so, yeah, it's omnipresent. So when you have any kind of images, and we know that when diverse populations make films, there are different perspectives portrayed. Again, women making films doesn't necessarily mean that every topic is about a woman, but it shows something of their perspective with all that variety, with all that lived experience. It brings that to the fore. It can be in subtle ways sometimes. Maybe you remember the film Hurt Locker, which won an Academy Award. Female director, war movie. Was there something uniquely female? I leave that up to other people, but the notion that we get these perspectives of a more diverse population is really what's critical. So just even, we can come back to visual media, but Advertisements. This is another thing is that men have 3 times the speaking roles in advertisements. I mean, this is just ads that are, bing, bing, bing in the middle of a show, the football game you're watching, the March Madness basketball, whatever it is. Advertisements are coming up. 3 times the speaking roles. Can you explain why that would be? I mean, in your personal experience, do women or men speak that radically differently in normal social settings? Have that much different
No,
speaking time?
no.
So again, we're being sort of trained to normalize that men are what you might call an authority voice in the trade that are recommending these things. They're seen to be more leaderly, directive, commanding. Just to fast forward a little bit, the psychological importance shows up in corporations, it shows up in politics, who people see as leaders, who people see as authoritative, regardless of the content that they're saying, is still heavily male by both men and women. We see men as more likely to be leaders. We see them as more likely to have authority positions. So you think, where does that come from? Media is part of where it comes from. Um,
Well, and so subliminally, as you said,
so subliminally,
you're not
yes.
even,
Nobody has to tell us these things.
no, it's
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
it's baked in.
It's totally baked in. Yeah.
And then
And
books.
books. So women read more books, buy more books. I guess you don't always know who reads, but
Right.
certainly buy in large percentages. And they usually say that women dominate fiction. There are exceptions. Again, men will go for mysteries, some of the spy thrillers in the fiction categories. Women will be across the board with fiction. Men tend to read more nonfiction. Whole separate topic. Are we sort of socialized for that? Do they think that's what they should be reading? Do they have different periods of time? That's another study. But we know women are reading more. Men still tend to be overrepresented in things like awards and reviews. If you look at who gets books reviewed, it tends to be more male authors in some of the major reviewing platforms, New York Review of Books, etc. Tends to be more male authors. So we're still highlighting, elevating male authors, and we know women are reading most books out there. Women are overwhelmingly populate book clubs, overwhelmingly.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a joke in the industry. Men don't do book clubs. There's a few exceptions, but women overwhelmingly do book clubs. So that's a thing. For people who study reading, if I used to teach middle school and high school English, and we always tried to get boys to read more fiction. And one of the reasons was not just to hopefully introduce them to something that could be phenomenally joyful in life and give them, another avenue to read about experience, but many of us learn about other lives through fiction. We learn about them through watching movies, we learn about them through films. How do we learn about experiences that are not our own? Many, many people historically learn about that through reading, through fiction. You're exposed to these alternative worlds. And so there's thinking that it produces empathy, it produces a willingness to have understanding. So if you're a
And
teacher of a
one of my
boy, you
moments,
want them to read fiction.
so one of my moments with that of that just, you have those kind of seminal moments with a book or The Kite Runner. That was
Yes,
a
yes,
phenomenal book.
yep,
And for me, reading that humanized the Middle East.
yes.
And there was a moment of when they were having a birthday party for a child, and it was just this moment, and I remember thinking, and I think that is the power of media, books, art, all of it, of, oh my gosh, these are, because our media would portray Middle Easterners in a certain way, after 9/11, that whole piece. And then to be reading this and saying, these are the same family structures, these are the same types of celebrations, these are people just like us, and humanizing and bringing that empathy and that moment of just reckoning for me of how I was thinking and how that perspective could be really broadened.
Which
And
is a great plug for what fiction could do. Male author, phenomenal book, phenomenal movie that was very closely connected to the book, if you've seen it.
Mhm.
And I agree, anything like that. I will say the same is often for visual media. You know, in our film festival, we have had a number of films from places like Afghanistan or Iran,
Mhm.
and they very often portray these human stories. We had one from some years ago, which was one of my all-time favorites, called When Mama's Gone. And it's about a father in Afghanistan raising 4 or 5 children, I forget now, on his own. The wife died in childbirth, and so the oldest child is maybe 10, and it runs on down, and you just see this poignant, fun, wonderful view of simple human life, not the kinds of things if you see your newspaper or perhaps your political news about Afghanistan. And you can think whatever you want of our political activities or our military activities, but it humanized it. It was just a wonderful, wonderful film about this man taking care of his children in rural Afghanistan. So it does have that power. It absolutely has that power. I want to just talk about another art form. I used to give talks and say to women who, especially in a place like Sarasota, we have a certain older population, phenomenally philanthropic, which is wonderful. And I would say, how many women are supportive of their local museums? And, many
Mhm.
hands would go up, their members, or how many volunteer or docents? They're in the gift shop. How many
Mhm.
work on behalf of the galas and their fundraising? Tons and tons and tons of women. And then I'd say, how much of the art in that museum do you think was made by women? You know?
Mhm.
And of our major museums, of the 26 major museums today, of the works of art, 87% is made by men. So that's almost 90%. And then
Wow.
I ask you to look at things like art schools, overwhelmingly female. Our Ringling College, right here, one of the best art schools, I think they're probably 70 to 80% female now. That's who's going in. So the point of that is we know women are going into the arts. We know they're artists. I know art groups all over. I know women who paint and sculpt and do all these things.
Mhm.
They're not represented in museums. They're overwhelmingly not represented well in auctions. The dollar value for, major works of art up at auction, tiny, tiny fraction of that goes to female artists. So we know these women are out there. We know they're making art, but art is not being looked at seriously, purchased by museums, brought into new collections, treated the same way in galleries or auction houses. Um, and this is one where I would say to these women, I said, you can make a difference. You run the gala. You're the docent. You run the gift shop. You're probably on the board. You go say to that museum, I love your museum. I'd like to see more works of art by women in this museum. Women have the power to do that. This is a recommendation. You have the
Mhm.
power. Let the curators find what they think is good, but let them know that we want to see a vision of the world through another set of eyes, not just through men's eyes. And I will say the major museums in America, most of the artwork is white men as well. So that's a particular experience that's being represented.
Right.
Obviously, artists are diverse, art can be very subjective, but if we are trained to think subliminally that the only art worth seeing and having or buying and venerating museums is a vision made by men, what does that do? Not only to our women artists, but to our sense of value. So
Mhm.
that's another area.
Well, so and I was going to ask you as we're getting ready to wrap this up, and it goes so fast, so fast. Um, what are some of the things we can do? I feel like number one is to be aware and question.
Absolutely to be aware. So if something like books, we already even talked about the theater,
Oh yeah.
plays, um, podcasts, movies, art, we go to these things. Take a look who's making this,
Hmm.
okay? Actively seek out, for starters, vote effectively with your pocketbook.
Hmm.
Actively seek out other forms of art made by women. Just try it. Of course, it's a huge variety. You may love some, you may hate some. That's totally fine, but work to bring in that perspective. And then talk to the people who are showing it to you. If you go to a bookstore and you look at the tables, bookstores still do exist,
Yeah.
both Barnes and Nobles and independent. There's a few Barnes and Nobles here in town which do phenomenally well.
Mhm.
Look at the books spread out. Look at the books that are highlighted. If they seem to be overwhelmingly male, you can go up there and talk to them. Hey, I love your bookstore. I'd love to see more works by women. Tell
Mhm.
them. When you get to the museum, walk around. See, next time you've got your house guests, you go to the museum, walk around and take a look. Take a look at the works of art.
Mhm.
When you go onto Netflix, see who's making those films. So that's one of the first is people can vote with their feet, effectively, with their pocketbooks and the works of art that they seek out. There was an interesting study they did in the theater, just to plug that one for 1 second. I think we have a minute.
Yes.
Is plays, so scripted plays were submitted to different production companies and theaters. Hey, do you want to do my play by playwrights? And the same exact play went as, I'll just pick a name, let's just say, Stanley Brown, and then
Uh-huh.
someone from Sally Brown. You can do
Mhm.
a perfect taste as how they were reviewed, how they were evaluated, and probably will not surprise you that Stanley Brown's play, identical to Sally Brown's play, was more favorably received. I mean, this is just crystal clear when you see this kind of evidence. So
Mhm.
again, we're all subliminally trained of which voices, whose works, whose perspectives are the ones that have value. And I think I've even talked to artists who are very dismissive of female art, that it's not as mature, that it's not as worthy. And I have challenged them. I've said, I suspect that you have had a lifetime of seeing male art and being told, this is what's worthy, this is
Mhm.
what's valuable. And maybe you also have a sense that's been skewed of what's valuable, of what's right, of what's real art,
Mhm.
So I would say the first one is to certainly be aware of who's making the material that you're seeing, buying, consuming, reading, listening to, etc.
Yeah.
Also, final thing on podcasts. Hey, we're on a podcast.
Right.
Comments to podcasts are read. If a podcast has no female guests and you listen regularly, you send it in. Hey, women can talk on these topics too. I'd love to hear some other different perspectives.
Yeah.
They were comments.
No, I think that that's great because, yeah, speak up, share feedback, right?
Make people aware of it. Yeah.
Well, because
And
sometimes it's unintentional. Like, and I know that sounds crazy, but sometimes people don't, if until you point it out, it's like, oh,
yeah.
yeah.
And to be fair, it's possibly somewhat unintentional on behalf of the people who were booking for things like
Mhm.
podcasts and shows and guests. It just becomes the norm.
Yeah.
That's who's in booking lists. That's who agents push. So somebody's got to step a little bit outside. And as I always say, there's nothing wrong with the male perspective. It's just not the only one.
Yeah.
So to get some more is really healthy for all of us to listen to, not just women to listen to, but for anyone to listen to.
I think that's the perfect bow on this episode. So
Good.
done.
We are going to have
Um,
a part 2 on this, and we're going
we,
to talk about reality TV
yeah,
and a few things like that.
I know. Great. Well, as
Thanks,
always,
Ashley.
great conversation, Scott.
Take care.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.